Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Institute, and I'm delighted to be able to host this very special event, the official launch of our latest Transition 2021 presidential transition memo focused on Turkey. A memo written by Dr. Soner Cagaptay, the Institute's Bayer Family Fellow and director of our Turkish research project, whose title is Defining a Realistic Policy Toward Erdogan's Turkey, Advice for the Biden Administration. And we've done about 10 or so of these reports focused on different aspects of American Middle East policy as a way to give some specialized advice to the new team. I think it's fair to say that America has lots of complex relationships across the Middle East. One can think of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, the U.S.-Israeli relationship, but there really isn't anything quite like the U.S. Turkish relationship, which is at one level so personalized between leader to leader, and at another level very institutionalized. Ally to ally, and the relationship between leader to leader and ally to ally, somewhere between the two, we have the complexity of what we see in Turkey and the U.S. Turkish alliance. Today's event is not just to launch Soner's very important paper, but also to bring together a remarkable group of experts on Turkish politics and the U.S. Turkish relationship to delve more deeply into the issues in this partnership and what the Biden administration, and specifically President Biden, is likely to face in dealing with President Erdogan. Today's event is titled, Can Erdogan Charm Biden? Question mark. That's because there's a history here of the president of Turkey successfully charming American presidents, starting off administrations very warmly, and then things, well, ending up not nearly as warmly as when they start. And we're going to take a look at all that today. I'm very delighted to welcome our panelists, an international group, if there ever was one, from Istanbul, from Stockholm, from here in Washington, but they all bring wonderful expertise to join with Soner in looking at today's set of issues. So very briefly, joining Soner is Asli Aydintasbas, Senior Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, who's joining us from Istanbul. Second will be Max Hoffman, Director of National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress here in DC. And then Jenny White, Professor at Stockholm University's Institute for Turkish Studies. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Soner, but first to all of our participants who are joining us on Zoom or on some other platform, I invite you to get into today's conversation. You can do this one of two ways. If you're on Zoom and you have a question that you want me to try to filter into our discussion, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you're on another platform, the Institute website, YouTube, Facebook, or something else, please send me an email directly at rsatloff, R-S-A-T-L-O-F-F, at washingtoninstitute.org, washingtoninstitute.org. With that, I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague and the longtime director of our Turkish research program, Dr. Soner Cagaptay. Soner.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's indeed great to be on this panel with you and my friends, Asli, Max, and Jenny, all coming from different cities, two continents, Europe, and of course here, America. I was going to say three continents, but I know Asli lives in Istanbul's downtown, so it doesn't really count as Middle East. I'm very excited to be officially launching my memo for the Biden administration. As you have said, this is a complex relationship that the U.S. has with Turkey, and complicated at the same time. Strategic is a 7-decade alliance, formal alliance, but it'll be hard to define the relationship between U.S. and Turkey as warm today. So my discussion, therefore, will center on three areas. I will first look at what is it that the problems are in the relationship, look at fundamental areas of disagreement. I'm happy to take, of course, comments and questions on that from my colleagues on the panel later on. Then I'll look at discrete areas of cooperation that I think exist, hence the complex and the complicated nature of the relationship. And finally, I'm going to look at how developments in Turkey's domestic politics could impact the way the Biden White House views Turkey. Now, typically, what happens in Turkey should not impact the strategic nature of U.S.-Turkish relationship, but I'll explain. So let me start with disagreements first, the core disagreements. There are really two issues here. One is Turkey's purchase of Russian-made missile defense system, S-400s, for which the U.S. has already, Congress has already sanctioned Turkey, and Trump administration put in place some of its own sanctions. And the U.S. argument here is that this is not compatible with Turkey's NATO membership. And on the Turkish side, the fundamental disagreement is continuing U.S. cooperation with Kurdish People's Protection Forces in Syria to combat ISIS. Now, YPG is an offshoot of Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, which is a terror-designated entity by NATO members. And again, it's about core NATO membership, or the way the two sides consider the relationship is that each is blaming the other for not abiding by its NATO membership obligations. So really hard to thread the needle, therefore, because I think in neither of these issues we're likely to see a complete resolution of the disagreement. Let me explain. Turkey's purchase of Russian-made missile defense system. Are Turkey and Russia allies? They're not. They have many areas of disagreement. Ukraine, I'll explain in a minute, Black Sea, East Med, Cyprus, and where they seem to agree, Syria and South Caucasus, they have tenuous power sharing agreements. But Turkish President Erdogan has a deep and evolving relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin. That's the important part of the relationship between Turkey and Russia, not that Ankara and Moscow are allies. Erdogan's relationship with Putin is interesting. I sometimes think that Erdogan has a political man crush on Putin. He likes the way Putin governs, wins elections, distorts electoral process, guts out institutions. Erdogan can't do a lot of that in Turkey because of Turkey's strong democratic traditions and resilience of its opposition. But there's also a security aspect of this relationship, or strategic concerns that drive this relationship. And I think they go back to the aftermath of the 2016 coup attempt against Erdogan. Just for context, before the coup attempt, Turkey and Russia were at the brink of yet another war. By my calculation, from the time they became hostile neighbors during the reign of Catherine the Great and until the fall of the Ottoman and Russian empires with World War I, Turks and Russians fought 17 campaigns. The Russians were overall instigators in these wars, and they were overall winners. So it looked to me in 2015, when Turkey shot a Russian plane that had violated its airspace from Syria, Putin slapped harsh economic sanctions and threatened to shoot down the Turkish auxiliaries in Syria, that the 18th war was going to start. But the coup attempt changed Putin's calculus towards Erdogan. While Turkey's Western allies sat on their hands, not sure what to do, Putin reached out. He was the first leader to call Erdogan. And Erdogan's first visit after the coup was not to Washington to meet President Obama at the time, or to Brussels for a NATO summit of support, because the coup was a nefarious attempt. But it was to Russia. More symbolically, Putin hosted Erdogan not in Moscow, but Russia's imperial capital at the Konstantinovsky Palace built by Catherine the Great. The symbolism of this visit or location was Putin was telling Erdogan, look, my predecessor, Catherine the Great, has started a tradition of bullying Turks. I, Putin the Great, can end it. Let's have a deal. That was a handshake. The handshake meant that Erdogan now sees Putin as his protector. Putin is the proven protector of threatened autocratic leaders globally. Not that they are similar to Erdogan, but Maduro and Assad and Lukashenko are some that come to mind. But more importantly, I think Putin is a 3D chess player. He's very good in taking advantage of these openings. So at their Konstantinovsky Palace meeting, he also gave Erdogan the green light to go into Syria, not to fight Assad regime, but to fight the YPG. Therefore, appealing Turkey and the United States and making a case to the Turks and Ankara that while the US works with YPG, Russia lets the Turks go after the YPG. And Not surprisingly, only 6 weeks after their Konstantinovsky Palace meeting in St. Petersburg between Erdogan and Putin, Turkish forces moved into Syria. And since they have gone 4 times to fight the YPG. I would say at that meeting, Putin won the war in Syria without firing a bullet, diverting Turkey's attention, the country with the most military resources on the ground in Syria opposing Assad, from Assad regime to the YPG. But Putin's platitudes don't come for free. If you ask me and you said, what did he get in return? I would say Erdogan's commitment to buy the S-400 system. Now, Erdogan realizes that that might be a mistake because to get the phone call from the Biden White House that he's been waiting for, it's almost 90 days into the Biden presidency. He still hasn't called. I think at this stage, Biden will call Turkey just before he calls Turkmenistan. The 2 countries come each other alphabetically. I'm joking. Turkey's a NATO ally, but you get my point. It's very delayed. The spark is not there. The chemistry is not there. So Erdogan knows that he has to do something on S-400s to win back Biden's confidence, to eliminate congressional sanctions, and duties opposition to including Turkey in F-35. NATO's next generation of fighter planes, very important. U.S. Turkish relationship is not driven by a large amount of trade, investment. It's not driven by cultural relations that Turkey has, let's say, with Italy. It's not driven by trade as Turkey has, let's say, with Germany. It's driven by defense ties. And what forms the bedrock of defense ties since for the last 40 years was the F-16 project that former Prime Minister Özal included Turkey in. F-16 is now being phased out. F-35 is next. It will last 3 to 4 decades. And if Turkey is kicked out of that project, that is the end of Turkish-U.S. defense ties for decades. Thankfully, the Pentagon has only suspended Turkey's participation. Erdogan would need to return the S-400s to Russia for Turkey to be readmitted to F-35 project, but he can't do that. Putin has many levers on Turkey, starting with tourism and trade. In fact, he just employed some of these tourism sanctions when Turkey signaled it wants to work with the U.S. In Ukraine to push back against Russian aggression there in eastern Ukraine. Russia immediately suspended tourist flights. Erdogan is hoping for a strong recovery of Turkish economy after the pandemic. His economy is Achilles heel. He wants economic growth to return so he can restore his base. Putin can easily shave off 2, 3, 4% points from Turkey's growth. If there are tourism sanctions, Russians are number 1 among tourist arrivals to Turkey. 7 million of them visited Turkey before COVID. And trade sanctions will be another one. Again, shaving off from Turkey's growth. Putin has military levers. Turkey and Russia are in power sharing agreements, very tenuous in Syria and South Caucasus. He can undermine Turkish forces or Turkish proxies there. Erdogan thrives on his global strongman image domestically that would hurt Erdogan. So he can't return the S-400s. That leaves us with a problem that can't really be fixed. In best case scenario, Erdogan would be well advised to not turn the system on. And then our diplomats and Turkey's diplomats, of course, can kick the can down the road, and they're able. Turkish diplomats are excellent, sophisticated group, can come up with a solution. On the U.S. side, the problem is also as tricky. With America deciding on the Biden administration that it wants to commit fewer resources militarily to the Middle East and focus on China, the Asia-Pacific pivot, it's unlikely that even if the U.S. relationship with the YPG comes down, it will end. And that will remain a constant source of consternation in Ankara regarding Washington. So I think there's really no way out of these 2 issues, barring aside a grand bargain between Erdogan and Biden. And I'll explain why that's also unlikely on the democracy part. But let me move on to areas of cooperation very quickly, because I don't want to give the sense that we have only problems. I think White House has actually been quite smart in embracing these areas of cooperation. Afghanistan is one of them. President Biden wants to get out of Afghanistan by the anniversary of 9/11 attacks in the US. Turkey is liked by Afghans of all political stripes. It has soft power on the ground. It could play the role of a mediator, and it's doing that. Ukraine is another area. Turkey sees its Black Sea neighbors with which it has excellent ties. Oftentimes colleagues on Twitter will tell me Turkey has bad ties with all its neighbors. I will tell them not Georgia, not Bulgaria, and not Ukraine across the Black Sea. Turkey sees them as balancing powers against Russia. So it wants to work with the US and Ukraine, and it will never accept Ukraine's annexation of Crimea, homeland of Tatars, who are related to Turks ethnically. So there's that Ukraine issue. Even areas where Turkey and Russia seem to have deals, such as Syria, and where US and Turkey disagree on the YPG issue, there is room for cooperation because Turkish presence there is the most significant anti-Assad presence by any military, and Turkey is therefore an ally to the US as US policies about changing Assad regime's behavior. Similarly, in Libya, I think if you go beyond our reductio ad Erdoganem, as I call it, meaning not boiling Turkey policy always down to passions for Erdogan, but understanding that Turkey's engagement in Libya, for instance, is driven by Turkey's broader national security concerns. Turkey has actually done a really good job of keeping Russia at bay. AFRICOM appreciates Turkey's role in there. So that could be an area of defense cooperation. Once again, because of the fact that Turkey has prevented a complete takeover of Libya by Russian forces. Other areas I think also exist in terms of cooperation. China is a big one. I'm happy to discuss this in the Q&A. Turkey has quite strong ties to Uyghurs. I don't think Turkey will engage against the Chinese because it relies on China for vaccines and soft loans, and Asli knows this better. Erdogan wants to build this mega project called Kanal Istanbul, hoping that the Chinese and Qataris will fund it. But if Turkey cooperated with the US against the Chinese, China being the only threat to the US globally, as outlined by the recently published national security guidance document, interim document, I think if there was Turkish-US cooperation in China, that would be a quantum leap in the relationship. And then the Biden administration, in my view, would be willing to put everything aside, everything we have discussed. So China would be a game changer. Not sure it will happen, but it would be. Let me move on to the last part of the conversation, domestic politics and how it is linked to how Biden administration will view Turkey policy. I guess here the issue is that Erdogan is at the height of his proscribed power, but he is at a historic low in terms of popular support. So he's become very powerful since the switch to presidential system in 2018. He runs Turkey from his palace, but his popularity is down to just about a third of the electorate. That's the lowest it has been since he won elections in 2002. As Rob mentioned, I've followed Erdogan's career for nearly 2 decades. I think he faces many problems. The economy is the biggest one. He delivered quite phenomenal growth until recently in Turkey, increased access to the pie, improved services. That is why his base loves him. And it's also the reason why he lost Istanbul, Ankara, and other big cities in elections, because the economy entered into recession in 2018 for the first time under Erdogan. The economy exited recession, but it's anemic growth, not doing really well. So in addition to, of course, economy, Erdogan had other challenges, establishment fatigue. He's been in charge for 20 years. He's no more seen as a problem solver. He doesn't represent the face of change. The opposition does. Decreasing support for Erdogan among younger voters. And that has a lot to do with Erdogan's anti-elitist message. You know, he's a nativist populist leader, so he likes to blame elites for the country's problems. That message worked when he first came to power, but now he's owned Turkey for 20 years. He's become, for all practical purposes, the quasi-sultan of Turkey's Second Republic. So when he blames Turkey's 20th century elites, 40 million Turkish citizens, that's just about just over 40% of the electorate in the election schedule for 2023, they don't buy that, because that 40 million was either born in this century or came of age under Erdogan. So they can't relate to Turkey's 20th century problems under its Kemalist elites. They believe that Erdogan owns these problems. So how will Erdogan handle this challenges? He's going to only oppress the opposition more, at the same time try to overwhelm the opposition. Remember, he's not necessarily a binary leader. He can do all these at the same time. He's going to overwhelm, oppress, divide, and court the opposition all simultaneously. So it's going to look not quite black and white, but the main theme of Erdogan's strategy forward is unleashing further amounts of oppression. Hard for me to see how the Biden administration will embrace that. But even more importantly, I think Erdogan might be humbled again in 2023 or early elections at the ballot box. He was humbled in Istanbul and Ankara, and Istanbul twice, in fact, when he repeated elections that he lost by a narrow margin, thinking that he controls all institutions. Why not? He can win. Doesn't work like that in Turkey. It's not Russia. That is because of strong democratic traditions, a resilient civil society, opposition parties, new and effective leaders coming up. So it's likely that Erdogan will maintain an unfair playing field, but it's very likely that elections will be free and fair the day they're held. and the electorate could humble him again. And if that happened, I could expect Erdogan to pull a Trump, to say, oh, elections were rigged, I don't accept their legitimacy. After what transpired in the US, I live in Washington, D.C., what I saw was basically an attack on the legitimacy of elections here. I think it's going to be very hard for President Biden to extend Erdogan a carte blanche if that were to happen. So I would say in the next 2 or 3 years, Biden will be presented a choice between democracy and Erdogan. He'll have to pick democracy. For his own sake, Erdogan will be given will play with President Biden, but he'll have to pick Putin. As I conclude, let me make some policy suggestions. Of course, I know Rob is going to ask me about them preemptively. Regarding the major differences, I would say if to the extent that Ankara and Washington can isolate YPG and S-400 issues and build areas of cooperation and maintain institutional ties, that's really important, institutional ties, because Erdogan is not immortal. One day he won't be on the political stage, and you're going to need institutions to maintain that relationship. The same applies to Turkey's democracy. And this is, I think there's a role for Europeans to play. Elections are still a source of legitimacy in Turkey. They remain free and fair. To make sure that that's the case, again, maintaining institutions, electoral institutions and legitimacy of elections is quite important. So I think if US and its European allies came together and engaged civil society and Turkey's, of course, democratic opposition, because ultimately Turkey's citizens will decide their country's future, that will be investing in Turkey's future. I want to end with this semi-optimistic note because I do remain optimistic about Turkey's future. I think that although it faces a deep crisis, many challenges in foreign policy, one of the reasons I love studying Turkey is that it's the exception rather than the norm when it comes to surviving crisis. You know, survived 3 decades of triple-digit inflation from the 70s until the rise of Erdogan. It survived civil war-like fighting on the streets in the 70s. I know Jenny has a great new book on that. It survived a PKK insurgency, supported at one stage by 3 of Turkey's neighbors, at least 3, Iraq, Iran, Syria. So it was survived this. I have great faith in Turkey's future, its institutions, its citizens. And I think that the issue is really going to be the 2 challenges, the 2 choices that the presidents will have. Biden's choice between Erdogan and democracy, and Erdogan's choice between Biden and Putin. With that, let me stop, as I do want to hear and look forward to it, of course, comments, questions, and pushback and debate from my colleagues.
Okay, thank you very much, Soner. Let's turn now to Asli Aydintasbas. Asli, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Soner. We actually both remember a time when this relationship wasn't as troubled as it is.
That's correct.
It was never a perfect marriage, of course, but it was a strong marriage, non-negotiable one. And obviously, on a broader spectrum, I really did like your report very much. Realism is definitely the order of the day, in the sense that I think much has changed, not just in Turkey, but also in the world. We are not so certain what the damage of the last couple of years is, both in terms of Turkey's democratic backsliding, but also in terms of the breakdown of the liberal order. I have been thinking for a number of years now that Turkey is pursuing its own, what I call Sonderweg, borrowing a term from German history, its own destiny, sort of wanting to be a standalone power, pursuing a strategic autonomy while wanting to have a foot in each camp. And your piece, in a very crisp language, you're making, you are pretty much saying there's only one way to respond to this, which is a more realistic approach. Not keep repeating the same mantra and sort of established viewpoints on Turkey, but sort of, you know, in a very pragmatic way, you are suggesting three policy options: expand areas where interests overlap, in Afghanistan, you name it, but also I think Iraq and Ukraine are other areas, and manage differences better, compartmentalize S-400s and these other issues, and human rights. And I really do appreciate that you've gone into human rights at great length in this in this paper, because just like you, and unlike many analysts that are writing about Turkey, I do think human rights can be, Turkey's democratic backsliding can be reversed. It did take place in a particular context of the last 4 years, which was the post-coup environment, but also the breakdown of the liberal order. Of course, we're not sure if the Biden administration will be able to, sort of resuscitate the Western-led or the liberal order, or actually ultimately give up and settle for great power competition. But if it is the case that there can be a resurgence, so to speak, of liberal values, and then Turkey cannot forever be oblivious to that. And history shows us that it's always been an ebb and flow, often coinciding with interests on the Turkish side. And all of this is to say, I think you're right to be optimistic, not giddy about it. It's not, obviously, Turkey's future is yet to be written, and we don't really know. But I think it's important to point out this sort of, you mentioned 40 million, 45 million. It is important to point out the domestic demand for a return to for a return to democracy of sorts. Turkey's destiny is not just going to be decided by what happens between Biden and Erdogan and whether or not a call takes place. It's also the internal dynamics. It's also what happens on the broader picture in terms of the Russian-U.S. dynamic, and of course regional issues. On a final note, I think the economy is very important here. It's always been a driver of domestic politics, and at this point, it's probably the worst we have had in 20 years of Erdogan's. 20 years of Erdogan's leadership. And history tells us, not just the past couple of years, but also the past century does tell us this, that economic grievances do translate into political grievances. And we're already seeing this happen in Turkey. So that brings me to the final question. Is there going to be a time in which Biden will have to be, as you say, Biden will have to choose between Erdogan and democracy? Is there a possibility of pulling a Trump, as you say, a situation in which elections no longer matter? Well, that ultimately depends on how big the push or the grievances or the opposition in Turkey is. In other words, to put it very bluntly, if we're talking about 1 or 2 points in the Istanbul elections, it was 13,000 in the first election, then yes, it will be a difficult situation. But if we are talking about a stronger show by the opposition, or sort of a more decisive sort of electoral map, then that would be a different case. And finally, perhaps this is also to sort of throw it at you, one thing that's missing in this piece, I think, is Erdogan's pragmatism. You mentioned it, but we have seen the sort of the various ways in which he has changed allies, partners, and it seems to me that the President Erdogan can be an autocrat or a democrat according to the needs of the day. So it would be very interesting to get your take on whether or not you think he can pivot back to Kurd or seek some type of a course correction in the run-up to the election if it is looking like a very sort of a small margin. Thank you.
All right, very good. Thank you very much, Asli. We're going to turn now to Max Hoffman. And before Max starts, let me just remind you, some of you have already sent me questions, but if these presentations are provoking more questions in your mind, please do use the Q&A function if you're on Zoom, or please send me an email at rsatloff at washingtoninstitute.org if you're on any other platform. All right, Max, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rob, and thank you, Soner, for putting this together and for your great memo. I was going to say, well, I disagree with everything Soner and Asli say, but obviously, as you probably guessed, there's a fair degree of overlap. I think that's because there's a fair degree of consensus in Washington on who Erdogan is and how to deal with him. I guess I would probably describe it as sort of grudging, pessimistic transactionalism at this point. And I don't really see it changing soon. I don't know any serious Turkey watcher who takes Erdogan's charm offensive seriously. I think pretty much everyone accepts that it was aimed at staving off EU unity on a firmer response and getting the claws into the Biden administration in the early months, and also trying to protect a very fragile economy, as Asli alluded to. But equally, the US has its treaty obligations, it has important interests, so very few people are eager to sort of lurch into a more punitive approach and see relations totally go off a cliff. And that has left us in this kind of uncomfortable stasis, I would say. On the Biden administration, my sense is that reformatting, let alone rejuvenating U.S. Turkey ties is pretty far down the list of priorities. And that's partly just because of the enormity of the challenges they face right now. But it's also a policy choice intended to, I think, establish a little healthy distance with Erdogan's Turkey. And the main change happened right away with the shift to a more institutionalized, normalized relationship from the personalized and totally chaotic dealings that characterize the Trump years. And these carefully managed senior contacts and the delayed presidential phone call you alluded to, I think are all, they're intended to send that signal to Ankara. And, but in terms of the broader policy alignment of the US toward Turkey, separate from the presidential relations, I think the major adjustments have been baked in over the last 5 years, and that, there weren't big adjustments necessary right at the start of the Biden term. As Asli said, and you capture in the memo, Erdogan sees a multipolar world. He wants to build Turkey into a stronger, more independent power in its own right, less deference towards its traditional Western allies. And to that end, he's adopted a transactional approach with the West, but also with Russia and China and other countries. And so now I'm glad you clarified, because when people say Turkey is turning to Russia, that's not quite right. It's transactional on that front as well. And we've seen that in just the last week or so in the Black Sea, but also, of course, for years in Syria and last year in the Caucasus and Libya as well. So, but in broad strokes, I think the thing is that the US is a status quo power, right? And the Biden team, this is a simplification, but they're sort of trying to put this regional order, put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But Erdogan is trying to disrupt and change that status quo because he's not happy with it. So there's no shared strategic vision between the US and Turkey right now. I think that's the reality, though there are certainly still overlapping interests. So, if Turkey is pursuing strategic autonomy, as Asli says, and as I agree, then it's kind of natural for the US to respond with a form of transactionalism. And that's what we've seen, right? And I think you see that in the expulsion from the F-35 program, in the hedging of bets, sort of hedging of regional bets with the expanded basing options in Jordan, with the deepened ties with Greece, the easing with Cyprus, and of course, the decision to continue stabilization efforts in eastern Syria with the SDF against Turkish wishes. So, I think from the U.S. government, the feeling overall is that the ball is in Turkey's court if they want to rebuild more strategic ties, and also that kind of managing the next few years and just getting through them to the scheduled elections in 2023 without a total blow up is a kind of a win. And I think it's natural and healthy for people to keep looking for positive areas to engage. That's also how a transactional, compartmentalized approach should work. The Black Sea, perhaps, maybe Libya, although, on that front, I think Turkey would still have to kind of give some things up in their view. Certainly, a big part, maybe the core of Turkey's charm offensive with the US is to portray itself as an essential partner in confronting Russia. But Erdogan's position on the S-400 really critically undermines that pitch. as does Turkey's vulnerability to Russia and Syria. So even if there was, a desire to accommodate or compromise Turkey from the Biden administration, Congress has drawn pretty clear red lines on the most contentious issues around the F-35, S-400, CAATSA sanctions. So I don't really see it. The grand bargain, as you said, Soner, is pretty unlikely. The thing is, I think that's probably fine with Erdogan. He's fine with transactionalism in return because it's not incompatible with his vision of a sort of more independent Turkey strutting on the world stage with the other major powers. But in my mind, the problem is that Turkey's expectations are still calibrated to the old relationship, a concessionary relationship based on the idea that Turkey and the US were strategic partners, and therefore, strategic partners deserve concessionary treatment. So Ankara wants to engage in this hard-edged transactionalism towards the US, but wants concessionary treatment in return. And they want to avoid CAATSA and get back in the F-35 program, but not give up the S-400. That's just not how transactions work, particularly when you're dealing with a more influential power. And whatever Erdogan's rhetoric, the US is still the more influential power here. So, I think we're in this stasis. There are a lot of flashpoints that could disrupt it, and you capably detailed many of them in your memo. I hope we get to them in the discussion. But I just want to finish with maybe two big picture points that echo some of what Asli was getting at as well. First, in my view, Erdogan saw Trump's clear disinterest in the region and spent 4 years staking claims, sort of trying to revise the regional order, kind of grabbing things and sticking them in his bag, if you will. That's in Syria, in Libya, in the maritime claims in the East Med, in Nagorno-Karabakh, et cetera. We may not here in Washington think those are in Turkey's long-term interests, but Erdogan does. And so the question for me is, if the US and Europe, by focusing on just kind of managing things along to 2023, are they essentially acquiescing to, or even implicitly endorsing these revisions to the regional order? That's my first big question. And the second is that, Biden has spoken of a global contest between democracies and autocracies, and that does seem to be his honestly held view of the world. I happen to largely share it. But despite the rhetorical pressure in these early months, I assume that the US will continue to prioritize strategic concerns with Turkey. Implicit in that choice, though, is the assumption that Turkey is a fixed asset on the democratic side of the ledger in this wider struggle. And I think that's very unclear. And then further, I think that Russian influence operations, Chinese economic statecraft or pressure, show that the contest that Biden is talking about is more often fought within countries than between them these days. And so while I'm cognizant of the limits of US influence within Turkey, and as both of you said, quite rightly, change has to come from the Turkish people, I do wonder if the US and Europe will need to take a more pointed and concerted approach to make clear to Erdogan the ramifications if he does steal the election or ban the opposition parties or take major anti-democratic steps of those kinds. So I'll leave it there, but thank you for putting this together.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Max. And since you ended on a note of perhaps Europe having to play a louder role, that's a good transition for me to turn to Jenny. Not that you're speaking for Europe, Jenny, but you are in Europe, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I won't be speaking for Europe. But I wanted to say to Soner that I thought this was a really good account of, very clear, incisive account of the problems and the opportunities. But what I'd like to do is push back a little bit on, how realistic are these opportunities, right? So a little bit going where Max just went. So, you have this dilemma. Turkey has a government and a leader that cannot afford to lose power. But if the elections were held now, they cannot win. So, they can't rely on the vote to stay in power. It's a dilemma. So what are the options? So as Asli pointed out, Erdogan is known to be extremely pragmatic and can turn on a dime to change his policies. But if one of the options is to go back to being a Democrat or democratic, the way he appeared to be at the beginning of his tenure, I don't think that will work because, and he must know that, because it's a huge risk, because he's not certain in that way to bring the voters back, especially the youth that Soner pointed out, that there's a terrible relationship between the youth and Erdogan, and they will make up, I think Soner, did you say 40% of the voting population by the time this election comes around? So there's, it's too big a risk to try to get the voters to come back to you. And so Erdogan seems to have decided that the answer is just further repression. There's no discernible interest in promoting the rule of law, anti-corruption policies, or any kind of democratic reform. So I think it's very unlikely for any US actions to have the effect of improving democracy in Turkey. I think that's just a non-starter at the moment. And it has to come from inside, and there's no indication that that's going to happen. Also, foreign policy has become a vehicle for Erdogan and his network to promote their interests, enrich themselves, and fend off perceived enemies. So that the upshot of that is that AKP policies are not rational policies that serve the interests of a state. They serve the interests of a clique of people. So this is not business as usual, where the Turkish government or Turkish institutions might respond positively to US offers of cooperation or other carrots that can be sent out there. And secondly, it begs the question of what on earth do Turkey and the US want to achieve in their relationship, echoing what Max just said. There was an interesting study last year by Çelik and Balta that concluded that popular support for Erdogan comes from his followers' highly emotional identification with Erdogan's strengths and vulnerabilities, that is, his role as victor and as victim, rather than with his party or ideology. Nobody seems to be particularly interested in that. So they make the argument that many of Erdogan's international policy decisions are ultimately aimed at a home audience, so that he can claim Turkey's international importance, Turkey as victor, Erdogan as victor, or can claim international aggression against Turkey, Turkey as victim. So this is actually very common. Commonly how international relations are understood in political discourse and in popular discourse. They're understood in these personal and emotional terms. So for instance, when Turks blame the interference of foreign countries on their being jealous of Turkey. So this victor-victim narrative is very deeply embedded in the national psyche. It actually predates the AKP, and it's a major link between the party and its popular support, and therefore motivates foreign policy. Okay, so let's ask, what exactly does the US need Turkey for? So from what I understand, President Biden's foreign policy specifically aims to create strength abroad in order to contribute to US economic well-being. He has linked foreign policy and national well-being structurally as well as intellectually. So how would better relations with Turkey contribute to that? I don't see a scenario here. And if the Biden team does wish to influence Turkey, it should understand that, which has been mentioned, that one, Turkey reacts to strength. Putin learned that, or knows that. And that secondly, politics is personal. It's personal whether Trump is in power or not. That's the way foreign policy is perceived. So Erdogan is very concerned with his standing on the international stage, with the glory that he reflects back to his country. You may be miserable living here, but look how the world admires us. So if foreign policy is personal, then make the response personal. Okay, so the telephone call, the missing telephone call, is a really good example of this. It's a way to address Erdogan without making him a victim of foreign aggression, right? It makes it personal. Is a very personal form of foreign policy. So it kind of undermines the victor role without making him the victim. So it puts him in a position where he has to do something, because he can't roll it into the usual rhetoric of victor and victim. Anyway, I just want to leave it at that. I think that I'm very optimistic, as Asli said, that there is a huge reservoir of democratic activity in Turkey, but at the moment, even the NGOs are either co-opted or underground. Here in the EU, there was a project to try and figure out how to possibly fund organizations that are legitimate in Turkey, that have not been co-opted, but that don't want to be seen, right? They want to continue their activities, but they don't want to do it in some official way. How does the EU fund people like that, right? So there's a huge problem right now of institutions having been co-opted, undermined, and the sort of democratic potential is sort of in hiding, and cannot easily be accessed without actually putting those people in danger, since Erdogan is very suspicious of any NGO or the opposition having dealings with the outside. So it's a real dilemma, and I just like to throw those questions out. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jenny. 4 fascinating presentations with lots more questions that we're going to have time to be able to get into. But let's get into some of them, including some of the ones, and I've gotten a couple of dozen questions from viewers around the world. Let me begin with something which might be on the agenda as early as next week, which is
you're going to ask.
I think you mentioned it in the report itself, Soner, the likelihood that or at least the possibility that Joe Biden is going to have a presidential statement on Armenian Genocide Day. Now, this plays into victimhood, and as well as victim that you referred to, Jenny, and some of the psychological aspects of the relationship and the domestic impact inside Turkey. Could you just play this out a bit, and how it might affect the transactional aspect of the relationship? Is Joe Biden going to have to pay something for this announcement, if indeed the administration
Sure, Rob. Thank you. And let me start by saying how much I enjoyed Jenny's, Max's, and Asli's contributions, colleagues whose work I respect and I'm an avid consumer of. So just to put into context, why is Biden not calling Erdogan? And of course, where there's a potential White House declaration recognizing Armenian genocide on April 24th, Armenian Remembrance Day, fit into the relationship. I think President Biden is not calling President Erdogan because President Biden is aware how much President Erdogan wants a call from President Biden. Here's why. There's a relationship between the state of Turkish economy and U.S. Turkish ties that ought not exist, but it's out there. If Turkish economy is not very good, is not a good shape, and if U.S. Turkish ties are in disrepair or look like they're not doing very well, the economy in Turkey simply tanks. That's what happened in 2018 during what is called as the Pastor-Brunson crisis. At that time, President Trump slapped some very minor sanctions on Turkey that would have cost Turkey's economy only $1.5 billion. Turkey's nearly the size of Spain, very sizable. It was before the crisis. And those sanctions by Trump nearly debilitated Turkey's markets. And that is because Turkey is not the Netherlands. When investors make decisions about Turkey's future, they not only look at its indicators, but because Turkey's east if you come from the west and west if you come from the east, markets also look at Turkey's direction. So its ties to Europe, its ties to US are seen as barometers of where Turkey's heading. So Erdogan now wants to change this narrative. He wants to form a narrative of good ties with the Biden White House. That's why he wants to get a phone call. And President Biden knows that. So he knows that now he has a window during which he can ask from Erdogan certain things. And I think his potential recognition of Armenian genocide next week fits into that. Not only President Biden has a campaign promise, but he feels that if he did this, that there would not necessarily be a rupture in U.S.-Turkish relationship. I'm not so sure about this because I think, while criticizing Erdogan's administration is acceptable, this could be seen, depending on how the wording of the declaration is framed by Turkey's public, as an American attack on Turkey. So I hope that's not the case. Broadly speaking, I think Erdogan has a similar relationship with Europe. U.S. is the symbolic partner in the West. Europe is the important financial partner. Much of the FDI and hot money into the stock market comes from Europe. European countries are Turkey's key trade partners, thanks to customs union, as a result of which Turkey is completely integrated into Europe. And one of the reasons I'm hopeful about Turkey's future is notwithstanding Erdogan's efforts to recast Turkey as a Middle East power, turn its face away from the Europe, it's not really going to happen because Turkey is so integrated to Europe. So Erdogan knows this. He wants to charm both Europe and the United States. That brings me to my question, Asli's question about Erdogan's pivot, and Jenny and Max also asked about it. I think Erdogan is very capable of another foreign policy pivot, and he's doing it. He pivoted in 2011 when he started to break up with the US over Arab uprisings. He pivoted in 2016 when, following his visit to Constantinople Palace, he built a relationship with Putin, and he's now pivoting again. Turkey is isolated, has very few neighbors except for its Black Sea neighbors that like Ankara. So it's trying to reset with Israel, reset with Egypt, maybe even with the Saudis, charm offensive towards Europeans and the United States. All of that might work. I think that EU, not more so than the United States now, is in a transactional relationship with Turkey. It sees Turkey as I'm sorry to say this and saddened also, as a giant refugee camp in which to hold Syrians, Afghans, and others. And so long as Turkey does that job, I think European Union is happy to turn its head the other way. I think the US is in a different position for reasons that have to do with political dynamics here, underscoring a principled commitment to democracy in Turkey and elsewhere is a way for Biden administration to restore American electorate's faith in democracy and institutions and elections as a source of legitimate transition of power. That's why I think Biden and Erdogan will have a hard time when that test comes up in Turkey, and that test will come up. And it's not because Erdogan is pragmatic that he will have to face these insurmountable forces of Turkey. It is because the forces are out there. One of the reasons I like studying Turkey is that I think that if countries could be vegetables, Turkey would be the analytical onion. Analytical onion because it never has a core. It defies Manichaean binarisms and broad generalizations. So is Turkey a dictatorship? No. Is it a democracy? Also no. I think it's a democracy that has fallen under an autocrat. It's not Russia. I would say it's more similar to Hungary and Poland, where similarly autocratic, especially Hungary, EU member, nevertheless, but still a country, a democratic country that's fallen an autocrat. Not only that, Turkey has an older democracy than does Hungary, a large and vibrant middle class. So I think the challenge here is for Turkey's European and allies and United States is to stand together. Just because Erdogan needs both right now to restore growth. If he can't restore growth, he won't win elections. It's that simple. It doesn't matter how oppressive he becomes. And so he has to restore growth and he has to establish better ties with US and EU. That's America's and Europe's leverage. They can stand together to convince Erdogan to accept a continuing role for civil society and opposition. Now, I wish Erdogan good health and long life, but nobody's immortal. The challenge is to keep Turkey's democracy resilient and alive while Erdogan is on the scene. And if I can make a pivot to foreign policy in anticipation of your next question, the challenge is also to keep Turkey in NATO while Erdogan is on the scene. And I think in that regard, the Biden White House is quite smart. It's embraced this idea that you can find discrete areas of cooperation and isolate areas of conflict. And I think this is also the policy I'd recommend for our European friends, maintaining Turkey's alliance membership in Europe. That is because Turkey has been, in my view, is and will always be bigger than Erdogan. It's really simplistic to boil it down to one leader. It's quite a complicated country demographically, too large economically, and too complex politically to fall under the thumb of its quasi-sultan. I think this is what Erdogan wants to take Turkey. Now, he's, of course, going to do whatever he can to stay in charge. He's not going to accept to be voted out. And that's, of course, the test that he's going to present Biden administration either in 2023 or even sooner if there are early elections, which could happen if Erdogan, is able to bring back some kind of economic growth strongly.
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to come in on either Soner's comments or on the impact of what Joe Biden might say next week? Asli?
I just very quickly, and much of this is in support of what Soner said, but I do think Turkey will downplay the Biden comments, recognition of Armenian genocide, if that were to happen, primarily because of the economic situation. And I cannot stress how important it is not just in terms of the domestic political dynamic, but also in as a driver of Erdogan's foreign policy and pragmatism. We are we are not just looking into a central bank which has net reserves in the negative and a country that has 30% unemployment and youth unemployment even higher. We are talking about a country where there is a discussion of a possible balance of payments crisis around the corner. And Turkey does not run, Turkish economy does not function if Turkey is cut off from the West. It's that simple. So nobody can sustain a continued fight with the US. Hence, you're seeing all these gestures and reach out to Israel, outreach to Israel and Egypt and whatnot, and a very careful tone when it comes to the Biden administration. Long forgotten is, are all the statements about how negative Biden administration would be if it were to come to power. So all of this leads me to think that it wouldn't be the sort of nightmare scenario that Soner described, Turkey seeing a genocide recognition as some type of attack on Turkey. I think there'll be a tendency to downplay it. Of course, there'll be statements, we don't recognize it and like it, but it just seems to me like Turkey cannot afford one more controversy with the US on this, one more high-profile controversy.
Fair enough. Very good. Max or Jenny, do you want to weigh in on this? Okay. A number of questions along the following lines. We've seen Erdogan have grand ideas about Turkey's role, grand strategic ideas. But really, should we all now just focus on the fact that he's just trying to stay in power? Is that ultimately what this is about? And that all the maneuvering is about, what is the tactic that will keep me in power beyond, the next month, the next year? But the grand strategy really isn't there anymore.
I think it was Asli, whose work I'm a great fan of, who tweeted a couple of weeks ago and said, Erdogan doesn't have a strategy, just pushing all panic buttons at the same time, hoping one will react or respond. Sort of like that. I think that Erdogan at this stage has got a really significant challenge from the opposition. And some of this may be his own creation. The switch to the presidential system in 2018 was supposed to make him all powerful. And it put Erdogan at the height of his prescribed power. But it actually did one thing Erdogan would never want to see. It unified his opposition. Prior to the switch in 2018 to a presidential system, Turkey had a parliamentary democratic system. So elections were multi-way races. And his party, being the biggest, always won those races by a plurality of the vote. That translated into a majority of seats in the legislature that usually happens in parliamentary democracies. Now, the switch to presidential system requires a two-way race. Opposition groups, until that moment, hated each other more than they opposed Erdogan. Opposition was constituted by disparate groups of Turkish nationalists and Kurdish nationalists, leftists and rightists, seculars and conservatives, who could never get together. But the switch to this system in 2018 told them, look, if you don't unite, you'll disappear. So they held their noses. They ran a joint candidate in 2018 presidential race. It did not work out. But the strategy worked out in 2019 in local elections, also because the economy went into recession just before that. And I think that's now his challenge. He's got a unified opposition bloc. He's going to try to do everything he can to divide it. And maybe it's not so, disparate, isolated measures. I actually think Erdogan is a great tactician. He's not only a consequential leader, probably the most consequential Turkish leader in 100 years, having amassed so much power, but he's also a great tactician. So he's demonizing the Kurdish Nationalist Progressive Alliance, HDP, in the opposition bloc. And there was a court case to shut this party down. I don't think they'll shut the party down. I think there's going to be constant talk of how this party is linked to terrorists, i.e. the PKK, in quotes, terrorists, and how, therefore, other parties being in the same opposition bloc with these quote-unquote terrorist parties is not acceptable. His target, I know this is domestic baseball, but I know audience will appreciate it. I'm seeing that a lot of people are participating from Turkey, diplomats, journalists, and a lot of Europeans who follow Turkish politics. I think his goal is to target the Kurdish nationalists to make it difficult for Turkish nationalists in the opposition bloc to stay in this alliance. Namely, Meral Akşener's EU party, representing Turkish nationalist factions in the opposition. If she leaves the opposition bloc because it becomes too costly for her to be identified with this other party Erdogan is demonizing, then Erdogan wins, meaning he gets a three-way race. If it's a two-way race, there's no way he's getting 50%. Even with economic growth coming back, it's just so, there was only one time he crossed that barrier, reaching 52 under dramatically different circumstances. As Jenny said, it's very hard for him to get to that majority. I think if Erdogan had a chance, Rob, he would restore the old system before the presidential system. That would divide the opposition again. It means he doesn't have to win with 50%. But you know what? That would accept defeat and wrongdoing, not Erdogan's brand. So I think he'll stick to the new system, but getting to 50% is almost out of reach. And so at this point, I guess the challenge is, can the opposition remain united? Can they bring forward a leadership that's inspiring? And that looks like they now represent change and problem solving and not Erdogan. There's some signs of that. Ankara mayor is polling quite well. Istanbul mayor not as good. He's under more pressure from Erdogan. For obvious reasons, Istanbul is more symbolic. I think Akşener herself is an important rising figure, also because she brings to the opposition bloc right-wing legitimacy. Turkey is first free and fair elections were held in 1950, not including years spent under military rule, that is 4. So that means we're in 2021. Turkey has been democratic for 67 years. Guess of those 67 years, how many were spent under left-wing governments? Just 17 months. Meaning this is basically a right-wing dominated country. So her presence in the opposition bloc is really quite an important piece of this puzzle. I think he has a strategy. It is to divide the opposition, to create a three-way race, and to oppress, unleash unforeseen amounts of ideological and political oppression. But I think Turkey's democracy is resilient, civil society is large enough, and memory of democracy is old enough that it's going to be hard for Erdogan. It's not Russia. It's going to be very hard for him, I think, to rig elections, even though the race will be unfair.
So let me ask our panelists, do you agree with that basic assessment that ultimately democracy will win out? Or has Erdogan's control over the levers of power for as many years as he's been in control eroded it to such a point that, well, democracy will have a tough time? Max?
Sure. Well, thank you, Rob. And I also kind of wanted to work in some of your response to your last question. I mean,
sure.
On will democracy win out? I agree with Soner that Turkey and Asli that Turkey's society is extremely resilient. And one of the things that Soner mentioned that deserves to be reinforced is that he lost Istanbul, AKP lost Istanbul narrowly, forced the rerun election, and lost by a landslide. And that, sure, it was an urban environment in which opposition poll watchers could sleep on bags of ballots, and there, was huge attention on the actual ballot protection, which was extremely important and probably can't take place across Turkey in AKP or MHP dominated places. So, there are huge concerns. But I think that point of it's hard to steal an election if you lose it by 5, 6, 7, 8%. Is probably right. I'd also just go, we did polling in 2017, 2018, which showed that Turks across the political spectrum have a really deep commitment to, to democracy. And there were a bunch of questions getting at that to try to sort of understand what democracy means. Some may define it narrowly as just the ballot box. Some may define it probably closer to the way we would, with press freedom and judicial independence and all of those things. But the point is, the ballot box is pretty much basic, and even AKP voters feel that way. And we saw that in Istanbul, where a bunch of AKP and MHP voters changed their vote after Erdogan forced the rerun. So in that way, now I think on the earlier question of how this is all tied into the foreign policy, I think that I agree with Asli. He's hitting the panic buttons. He has been for some time. If you think about the big factors contributing to the erosion of AKP and Erdogan support, it's the economy, obviously. It's the refugee issue to a large extent also. And it's just long-term incumbency. He can't really do much about long-term incumbency. He's trying to keep an even keel on the economic front, although he fires a central bank governor every quarter. So, that doesn't help. But on the refugee question, I think that has driven Turkey's Syria policy for the last 2 years to a greater extent than people appreciate, carving out, almost 2,000 square miles of Syrian territory where Turkey has effective control, trying to present those areas to basically externalize the refugee question, the same way, frankly, Europe has externalized the refugee question to Turkey. And even in Libya, I think that's sort of a case of tactically taking advantage of a power vacuum. It also enabled him to throw a wrench in his regional rivals' energy plans with the maritime deal with the GNA. But the timetable of Turkey's escalation in Libya also aligns with the timetable of Russian and regime escalation in Idlib province in northwest Syria. And Idlib remains this kind of sword of Damocles hanging over Turkey's head, with the prospect of massive further displacement if the Russians and the regime go in some sort of offensive of annihilation. And I think that Erdogan in 2019 was throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck with Russia. And the Libya intervention was part of that, of saying, hey, you go in big in Idlib, we're across the table from you in Russia and the Caucasus, in Syria. We can make life difficult as well. Don't force us into this corner. So that's tied to the refugee issue, which is a big part of his domestic erosion. And I think just Erdogan, I don't know if Soner would agree with this, but getting to Jenny's point about how personalized it is, the victimhood and the victories, I think Erdogan's first thought on a lot of these foreign policy questions is like, how are my guys in Fatih gonna respond to this? If I do X, if I do Y? It seems to me anyway that you can't explain most of these foreign policy decisions without applying that domestic prism. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, very good. Jenny, do you want to get in on this?
Sure. I think that, as Soner said, this won't always be the Erdogan era. There will be a post-Erdogan era, and there we can find all kinds of things flourishing. But in the meantime, perhaps the U.S., in terms of, for instance, imposing sanctions, should think about the issue of the country as a whole, which is not the same thing as the institutions or the individuals who are making the foreign policy. Any kind of major sanction that affects the Turkish economy, the way Soner described the previous sanction tanking the economy, it actually strengthens Erdogan, because it allows him to say, we are the victims of these outsiders, these outside forces, just like they're always doing. This is not my fault that the economy tanked. So it actually strengthens his position to do that. However, these targeted court cases that target his circle and the banks and so on, those are, I would put those in the category of personal politics, right? So the government really stays away from that. It's the courts that do it, but it does have an effect on the actual network that surrounds Erdogan. And he also he doesn't only have to keep the loyalty of the people, but he has to keep the loyalty of his network, and he has to keep provisioning them in order to do that. So, if it can affect that, it's very targeted, rather than, something that would punish the people as a whole, which has repercussions down the road, I think. Yeah.
So let me.
I just one more thing.
Oh, please, go ahead.
That I worry about the armed militias that have kind of proliferated, under Erdogan. He has personal control over, I think it's called Sadat. There are a number of these militias around, and other institutions that have become armed. The Bikçi, the guards, and so on. So, there has been a pattern of whenever there is a political problem that these people come out of the woodwork, and now they're organized and armed. So I don't know what role that will play. If it's not just trying to steal the election, it may be something a little bit more, perhaps like the militias we see here, but more organized. I don't know. So that worries me a lot, because before we get to the democratic flourishing, we may see something quite violent that may hark back to, say, the 1970s.
So I assume you mean here, the United States, not here in Sweden.
Yes. I'm sorry, not in Sweden.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. Let me ask you this last question, which sort of brings to a head the question, the issue of reaching out to the people and the institutions rather than versus dealing with Erdogan as the singular leader. And it could be summed up in this: Joe Biden is going to hold what he calls a democracy summit. Should he invite Turkey? Does that reflect an invitation that would reflect Turkey's underlying democratic institutions be beneficial, or would not inviting Turkey, which would highlight the autocracy of its current leader, would that be more beneficial? Yes or no?
No. And here I'll explain why not.
Very briefly. Very briefly. I want to get everybody's view on this.
Oh, I see. Okay. I'll say no, but I'll explain when you give me another 30 seconds.
All right. So you said no. Hold on. Max, yes or no?
I think if you invite him, you have to invite dissidents and civil society activists and press him hard. And therefore, I think if you invited him under those conditions, he would not accept. But
okay.
I cheated, sorry.
That's a cheating answer there. Okay. Asli, what do you say?
I think my answer is going to be similar to Max. The elected mayors that are serving right now in big cities, they ought to be part of this initiative, in my view. There's some elected mayors who are in jail from Eastern Turkey, Kurdish mayors. But the only condition that Turkey could be at that table if you also have civil society and municipal mayors at the local level, local democracy, representatives of the local democracy also represented.
This isn't exactly how summits run, but okay. And Jenny, yes or no?
I would say it depends on what they want those people to do at the summit. If they are all required to make some kind of official commitment, then yes, let's invite him. But I think that's unlikely. And so I agree with Max and Asli that unless you invite the people who are the democratic advocates, like the mayors, I don't see the point.
Okay, so Soner, you get 30 seconds.
Rob, you didn't let me cheat. I guess it's because you're my boss and you pay my salary. So my explanation of why I said no would be, I think that the public diplomacy strategy of the United States, when the decision is made, the diplomats who would write this decision explaining it to the Turkish public should be making it clear that this is criticism targeting Erdogan administration and not attacking Turkey or trolling its citizens. And I think, I am not saying U.S. diplomats do this, but it's a common fallacy. We see so much of Turkey through Erdogan that oftentimes I think it clouds our policy and our country, other countries' policies towards Turkey. And people say Erdogan's war in Libya, Erdogan's war in Syria. They're not his wars. Similarly, I think measures targeting or excluding, if Turkey were to be excluded from the summit, this should be explained as while the U.S. believes Turkey is a democracy and wants to see it so, Washington doesn't believe that Erdogan deserves to be at the summit. I think it's a very clear way of saying Turkey is a democracy. We believe that it will continue to be one, but its current elected leader is exactly acting like a democratically elected leader.
Okay, very good. But regrettably, we need to end it there because we've reached the witching hour. I want to thank all of you, Asli, Jenny, Max. Thank you, and congratulations to you, Soner, for your paper. You can find the paper on the website of the Washington Institute. Please go ahead and read it if you haven't already. And I hope that someone in the administration, actually quite a few, are reading this to help prepare for what will be the inevitable engagement between President Biden and President Erdogan.